I'm Brendan Case. For those of you who haven't met me, I work at the Human Flourishing program here at Harvard, and we're very happy to be co-hosting this wonderful event. And I am honored to be your MC for this session. So the theme for this parallel session is economic prosperity and social connection. Some of you might be wondering why we're having a session on economics at a conference on loneliness and isolation. And I hope that the conversation among our distinguished panelists today will make clear just how central economic factors are actually as drivers of rich connections or disconnection. You see this in many areas of life. When stagnant wages drive down marriage rates, when erratic just-in-time scheduling makes it impossible for workers to keep a social calendar. We can multiply examples, and I'm sure our panelists will. But in the interest of getting me out of the way, let me introduce our panelists quickly, and then hand things over to them. So I am thrilled that we will be guided through today's conversation by Chris Griswold, who will be serving as moderator for the discussion. Chris is the policy director at American Compass, which is a think tank dedicated to restoring an economic consensus that emphasizes the importance of family, community, and industry to the nation's liberty and prosperity. And Chris is joined on our panel today by Elizabeth Garlow. Elizabeth is a well-being economy fellow in New America's New Practice Labs and co-founder of the Francesco Collaborative, which works with faith-based groups to invest in a solidarity economy. She previously served as a policy advisor with the Obama administration's Community Solutions Task Force, where she managed the president's Promised Zones initiative. And last but not least, we have Adrian Pabst, who's a professor of politics at the University of Kent in the UK, and deputy director of the National Institution of Economic and Social Research, a think tank in the UK, which was founded, I believe, by John Maynard Keynes. Big shoes to fill, Adrian. So please join me in welcoming into the conversation.
Good afternoon. Can you all hear me? Yes. Welcome to the session on economic prosperity and social connection. Proudly PowerPoint free. Just to continue what Brendan was saying, why on earth in a conference about social connection are we talking about economics? And not just economic conditions, but even economic policy and policy making. Speaking of Keynes, Churchill famously said, if you get two economists in a room, you'll get two opinions unless one of them is Keynes, in which case you'll get three. And economics, I think, can strike a lot of us as very abstract and technical. And so I just want to set the table really quick before I get out of the way and turn it over to our amazing panelists, who I'm really excited to hear from. And the first is just what Brendan was saying, which is that economic conditions, certain economic conditions are required for healthy communities to form, for healthy families to form and thrive. And conversely, the lack of those conditions or the presence of negative economic conditions can make it much harder for the basic units of social connection to form and thrive. And we can talk all the way from the grand scheme of macroeconomic forces like globalization and what it means, for example, if a community that was once anchored economically by a certain industry has that industry leave and not see it replaced by anything else, all the way down to kind of the day-to-day things. So again, as Brendan mentioned, just-in-time scheduling, which can make it very hard for an hourly wage worker to schedule childcare or to schedule family time, or to schedule participation in local community life. And if those questions intrigue you even a little bit, that's why we're here, because it actually does matter deeply to talk about the relationship between economic conditions and human connection. And maybe diving one layer deeper, I think it's really useful to reflect on how the economy is the place that a lot of us experience the most connection with other people in a shared project, where we try and accomplish something together that we couldn't accomplish apart. And in a really basic sense, that's one way of thinking about what the economy is. Going as far back as Aristotle understood that civic friendship, that sense of shared participation in a common project, that comes out of the practical experience of being put in the same boat on a utilitarian project. Once we realize we need each other to get ahead, that's the foundation of civic friendship for Aristotle. The Catholic social teaching tradition says something very similar. Pope John Paul II, this is an amazing quote. It is characteristic of work that at first and foremost unites people. In this consists its social power, the power to build a community. And so maybe I'll just end by saying, whether or not that can happen, whether or not work and economic life can be conducive to the experience of connection and solidarity, has a lot to do with the with the policy parameters that we put around that social experience and that economic experience. Because of course, the other place that's intended to be the place that we can convene and interact to accomplish something we couldn't accomplish alone is democratic government. That was Lincoln's famous phrase about the legitimate purpose of democratic government, is for us to be able to do together what we can't do in our individual capacities. And so I'm really excited to think about economic conditions, about the relationship between policy and economic conditions. MLK, Martin Luther King said in his speeches to the labor movement, when he's trying to convince the labor movement in the 60s that it needed to work with the civil rights movement, that gaining access to the vote would not be enough without a meaningful voice in the workplace. You can't talk about economic conditions that are conducive to human connection and thriving and a sense of participation in the nation's life without talking about policy. You can't talk about policy without considering how it affects economics. So with that, let me give you a really quick roadmap of what we're going to do, and then I'll kick it over to the panel. I'll give the panelists a little bit of time to say how they think about this issue. And we'll have a Q&A. We'll open it up to you all for some question and answers. And then I want to spend hopefully at least about half of our time breaking out into smaller groups and then sharing with one another what we think. We're not the only ones with something to say about this. This is a room full of engaged and wise people. And it would be a crime not to allow you to learn from one another as well. I'm going to be a little bit strict on time. The Surgeon General of the United States is talking at 3 o'clock. So we will end promptly at 2:45. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion. So first, let me just ask, maybe we'll start with you, and then Elizabeth, same question to you. Tell us your view on this topic, how you think about human connection and human thriving, and what on earth that might have to do with economics.
Well, I think it's got everything to do with economics, because there is no social flourishing without material prosperity, but likewise there's no material prosperity and well-being without human and social flourishing. The two are so intimately connected because we are both material and symbolic beings. We are not just in need of food and physical shelter and all of the material things that are very important to our survival and to our thriving. We are just as much in need of meaning, of purpose, of a sense of calling and vocation. And therefore, I see these as completely connected, just because the economy is really part of society. Society is what's primary, right? The economy, politics, and all sorts of other things are generally secondary and should be at the service. And when they're not, when the economy is, as Karl Polanyi said in The Great Transformation, when the economy becomes disembedded from society, that's when we start having problems. And I think we've seen over the past years and decades a process whereby the economy has been seen to be separate and often to be primary. I mean, we all remember the phrase, "It's the economy stupid." I don't have to tell you how influential that has been. And I think that has really led us, I think, to the situation we're in, where the economy is not working well, society is not working well, and actually it's precisely because we have disembedded markets from their social and civic ties. So the two are absolutely interconnected. And maybe the way to think about this is just to start with who we are as human beings. As Chris has just said, Aristotle tells us that friendship is the most fundamental principle of politics and of society. And it's also the case that we are social animals, even more than we are political animals. That is something that Aquinas emphasized very much. Which means what? That we are really meaning-seeking animals. We are storytelling animals, and ultimately we are fundamentally dependent upon another. We are relational creatures, and the economy has to mirror that as much as possible. And that means it has to cater to our fundamental social nature in terms of our talents and our vocations. the old economic principle, division of labor, is an important one because we don't all have the same talents, but we all have talents, and they all need to be valued so that individually and together we can flourish. And really, what's at the heart of this, again, as Polanyi said, is mutual recognition. We have talents, we have vocations, and I think what we fundamentally seek is not power over others or lots and lots of abstract wealth. What we seek fundamentally is mutual recognition, to be recognized for our talents and vocations and to recognize others for theirs, so that we can make a contribution, we can serve ourselves and others, and we can be rewarded for that, both materially and symbolically. And a lot of this is also about belonging, and belonging to places, to very particular places, and that of course includes the workplace. We spend more time at the workplace than we spend time almost anywhere else, maybe except for bed, but we know how little people sleep when they commute a long distance and work very long hours. So the workplace really is very central to our everyday existence, and yet the workplace is not at the moment the source of meaning, the source of self-esteem, the source of purpose, and the material reward it should be. So we have this problem in front of us. I will conclude very shortly, but maybe if I can just say a couple of more things. One is that I keep on mentioning Polanyi because I think it's the road not traveled. It's the one economic and social vision that we haven't really pursued. And his book, The Great Transformation, was published in 1944. So it's going to be the 80th anniversary of that book next year. But it's also the 80th anniversary of Bretton Woods. Keynes was mentioned. I feel duty-bound to mention him again, as an example of how we got, beyond totalitarianism in the 30s and 40s, beyond, a Second World War in the space of 20 years, and also the economic depression, of course, that had hit us in 29-32. So Bretton Woods, I think, was a very important moment in that the whole post-war settlement, starting with the New Deal in this country, was a very important moment. But what's the other book that was published in 1944? And this is not a quiz game, so I won't treat it as such. It's, of course, Hayek's The Road to Serfdom. Now, what also happened is once the post-war settlement, was in crisis in the 70s, it was ultimately replaced much more by the vision set up by Hayek in The Road to Serfdom. Right, that was the book carried around by a certain Ronald Reagan and a certain Margaret Thatcher, and that is essentially at the heart of what we now call neoliberalism. Now, if both the post-war settlement and neoliberalism were at some point in crisis and aren't working, we have a great opportunity now after the financial crisis, after so many other shocks like COVID, like the cost of living crisis in the wake of the war in Ukraine, and many other crises besides. We have an opportunity to build a system or model that mirrors much more closely Polanyi's, and that I think is what we ought to do, because the current one is clearly not working. Right? We have a corrupt corporatism of big finance, big tech, and big government, not on the side of working people, not on the side of community, not on the side of belonging. And we have, if I can just mention before I will give the floor to Elizabeth, we have 3 C's. I mean, they're ugly words, but I'll mention them anyway. We have a concentration of wealth, we have a centralization of power, and we have a commodification of everyday existence. They're fundamentally the conditions that we all confront. I say we all, there are roughly 20% who are doing okay and quite well, and there are 80% who are increasingly leading precarious lives full of debt, full of uncertainty, full of loneliness. And I think it's that condition that we must confront. And I think Polanyi, amongst many others, is a way for us to think how both material prosperity and social flourishing really have to go hand in hand. It's not about saying the economy is first or culture comes first. We now need to bind these again together. And that, I think, is the great challenge in front of us.
Thanks, Adrian. So in 2007, I spent 3 months in Brazil visiting with a network of cooperative enterprises who shared with me that their purpose was not to maximize wealth, but to maximize decent work. And I was 22 years old, and at the time I had been studying neoclassical economics in an American university, a small liberal arts college in Michigan. And I remember thinking, oh, wow, everything I've been studying about this sort of undergirding assumptions of neoclassical economics just does not fit this lived reality, this experience on the fringes of Sao Paulo. And I fell so in love with the people that I met and the experiences they had and the sense of agency and purpose and meaning and belonging that workers had in those settings that I decided to continue my study in cooperative economics. I ended up spending some time in Italy, learning from the Emilia-Romagna region, which maybe some of you know about or have spent time in, but the social economy there is so interesting in how it's developed to provide economic structures and spaces for people who might otherwise be hard to employ, for childcare, for elder care, the things that are so core to our lives and to our economies, but don't fit the logic of profit maximization and wealth supremacy. And so I think there is this kind of capacity for moral imagination that we need, that we have still to build in this country, in this society, and that we're just sort of, beginning to scratch the surface of as we have these different entry points to this conversation, like this entry point of social connection and belonging, this acknowledgement of our deep sense of loneliness, the mental health crisis. These are, for me, on-ramps to a conversation about not just how we care for ourselves, for one another in our communities, but how we care for the structures that we have to transform to hold our society differently. And so part of what brings me into this conversation today is this question of how do we transform the economy? And, yes, there are some big policy levers to think about, and I'm spending some time working with government leaders at different levels of government who are asking this question of how do we decenter GDP growth as the way we think about progress, right? If you think about what we hear in our everyday kind of national reporting, so much of it is about the stock market, whether it's up or down, or GDP, or whether it's up and down. Well, the reality is the stock market was doing really, really well at the height of the pandemic. If you had just looked at the stock market, you wouldn't have known anyone was suffering. So clearly we have a major disconnect in how we think about the economy, how we make policy for the economy, and what's happening in people's lives. So that's one kind of policy lever. The other thing, though, that I think about is something that the three of us were talking about as we were preparing for this, was this idea of economic supremacy, capital supremacy. You were bringing this up, Adrian, but we live in a society where so many of our interests are subordinate to the interests of capital, right? And we know that the way we've sort of structured things is to maximize shareholder investor wealth. When you have an economic system that's entrenched in a narrative that says financial wealth and financial wealth maximization is your morality, we have a problem. So from my perspective, I think problematizing that and bringing in other values, the value of care for our earth, the value of care for our community, the value of relationship, starts to kind of disentangle you from those dominant narratives and open you up to thinking about the kinds of experiments you can run in your places, in your communities. So I think there's more of this happening than people even know about. I think, Amarillo, Texas has an amazing combination of experiments happening at the intersection of democratically owned firms, public banking, and community land trusts. I think many people in this room have had encounters with communities that are trying to run these kinds of small experiments to decommodify our lives, right? And to recognize that financial price, is not the only signal of value. That value is very multifaceted, it's very personal, it's very communal. And the Old English translation of wealth, wealth, is actually the conditions for well-being. So you can have a wealthy life that isn't just about financial accumulation. And so I think there are ways forward that people are thinking deeply about and trying, which from my perspective have a lot, I think one of the things we need to be focused on the most right now is participation in co-governance. Adrian was talking about the centralization of power and control. I'm very concerned that 3 non-bank financial institutions, asset managers, own about half of the wealth in our market economy. That is in turn steering our political agenda, it's steering our corporate agenda. And so I think there are ways that the localization of concerns and democratic forms of governance are being tried and could be furthered through various kinds of experiments. So we can get more into the details, and I'm curious what people are saying in your own communities and what's intriguing you. But yeah, I think that's some of where I'm coming this conversation from.
No, that's really fascinating. I think we can already see how we could spend all day talking more about the foundations of how to think this way, or all day talking about the policy implications of it. And I want to get to the policy, but before we do that, I think it's probably useful to not skip the foundational questions too much, because you both have just pointed to really rich veins of thinking. And also to not skip clarity on how deeply market thinking influences us now, all of us. We throw around the term neoliberalism all the time without, I think, often stopping and asking what we mean by that. At least what I mean when I say neoliberalism is the belief that market efficiency and optimal outcomes are the same thing, that whatever the market optimizes for is by definition the most socially useful outcome. And as you say, where that's clearly not the case. And yet we have this deep habit of mind. I mean, even the terms we use, human resources, even social capital, right? We find ourselves addicted to market and kind of econometric terminology, even to talk about opposing neoliberalism. And I would love to hear both of you briefly talk a little bit more about that, about what is your diagnosis of the frame of mind that got us here, the style of thought, and also a little bit more about the resources you both draw on that point us in a different direction. Adrian, you mentioned Polanyi. If I was in the audience, I would be Wikipediaing who the hell that is. So maybe give us a brief sketch of what his proposition is.
Yeah.
And Elizabeth, I know you're deeply read on Catholic social teaching. Maybe you could give us a quick preview of how that offers alternative ways to the market thinking that dominates at the moment. Adrian, go for it.
Well, thank you, Chris. And Karl Polanyi is an absolutely fascinating character. And I've only mentioned the Great Transformation as so often. You know, there are many, many books, many essays worth reading. And I suppose one fundamental insight that Polanyi develops, that of course he also has learned from others, is, you know, when we talk about the economy, what do we really mean? We don't just mean a system of production and exchange, though that is clearly an important part. We really also mean a social system that is about ultimately the exchange of gifts. Okay, so the origins of the economy is both the household. I mean, that's the Greek word of oikonomia, oikos, is the household. So it's about how you sustain, right, the sort of the living and flourishing of a household, but also what really makes for production and exchange. And it is ultimately this idea that everything is gift. Language is gift. Okay, so I offer you my words as a gift in the hope that they will speak to you and that it will be somehow received and then returned in the form of a question or comment or, you know, an objection, a criticism, whatever it is. But that's the basis of all conversation, right? Someone offers the word, and gifts are given, received, and returned. That is the endless flow, and that is what society ultimately is all about. That is what family, work, community, neighborhood, and nation is ultimately all about. And it sounds fantastical, utopian, perhaps almost abstract, but it isn't, because gifts are very specific. And they are really, if you like, the glue that hold together human societies, including the economy. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't also have production, exchange, money, and other ways of facilitating that. But we mustn't forget the fundamental dimension of gift exchange. So how can we have an economy that in some sense mirrors this idea of gift exchange? Well, for instance, by injecting into contract more gratuitousness, more giving. So that contract doesn't just become a transaction between two individuals or two entities, but actually is also founded on something like trust and cooperation. Because believe it or not, trust and cooperation are what? They're gifts, right? You can't mandate trust. You can't write into a law or regulation or contract, you must trust this person or someone else must trust you. It doesn't work like this. You can't mandate cooperation. So in order for contracts to work, for transactions to be meaningful, you need trust and cooperation. They're ultimately gifts. So we need to find a way of injecting that into the economy. And the thinker that does that most of all, I think, in modern times, much more so than Adam Smith, is an Italian economist called Antonio Genovesi, who was a near contemporary of Adam Smith. Now, this is really going to trigger the Wikipedia searches. But sadly not translated into English, and hence much less well known than I think he should be. And there's a masterpiece called The Lectures on Civil Economy, and we're hoping, I say we because it's a group of colleagues, that we can finally have that book translated into English, so that treasure can be shared and can be better known. But Genovese's insight is this, that in a market economy, and he was definitely committed to a market economy which was taking shape in the 18th century, you can have gift and you can have virtue. Whereas Smith would be saying, well, yes to virtue and yes to gift, but really they're more to do with the thick relations of family and friends. And the more you move away from that, the more impersonal it gets, and the more it is really about self-interest, or enlightened self-interest, as Smith would say. And I've got nothing against enlightened self-interest. It's obviously much better than unenlightened self-interest, clearly. And a measure of self-interest is also part of who we are as human beings. But we can do better than enlightened self-interest. And Genovese shows us how. And I think Polanyi is then the 20th century figure who takes that forward. Why do I mention all of this? Because the term civil economy occurs in one of the most important social encyclicals, Caritas and Veritate, published by Pope Benedict, at which point I'm handing over to Elizabeth, because she's going to tell you all about Catholic social teaching.
So I'll share a little bit about Catholic social tradition. It has informed a lot of, I guess, my formation and thinking on this topic. But and then I want to share about a couple of sort of folks I see writing on this today who I'm inspired by. So Catholic social tradition emerged at an interesting time of kind of the emergence of industrialization and really poor working conditions in factories. And at that time, Pope Paul VI was interested in offering commentary about the importance of work over capital, right? And if you think about, and the dignity of work, and if you think about where we find ourselves today, capital is supreme to work. Work is at the service of capital, not the other way around. And so it kind of goes back to that experience I was sharing, having these encounters in Brazil and seeing a different way of thinking about the purpose of the economy to provide good and dignifying work. And I think what you opened us up with, Chris, about the importance of relationships in the workplace as part of who we become and how we become who we become is so central. And in my own life, there have been many ways in which being in workplaces that have also become communities, or being in a shared struggle with others in a workplace, has played a foundational role to my sense of self, my sense of identity. And so I think many experience the need for good and decent work, and many parts of the world lack that. And I think it's among the biggest drivers of social isolation and disconnection. So Catholic social tradition places a big emphasis on the dignity of work, the pursuit of the common good, and then a couple other facets. So solidarity. So there's a long tradition of solidarity in Catholic social teaching that really is about sort of being in relationships of deep communion with your neighbors. And that has an element of reciprocity to it, right? So if I'm showing up with my needs, I'm also participating in an exchange of gifts with my neighbor. And I think drawing from that, there's this idea of subsidiarity that's kind of getting more and more traction, which is that decision-making needs to be taking place at the highest level necessary, but the lowest level possible, meaning it has to be distributed. It has to be participatory. And so that goes back to some of these pieces around co-governance and co-determination that I think are supremely important right now. Marjorie Kelly, who's with the Democracy Collaborative, just put out a book last week called Wealth Supremacy, which is really looking at, oh, hello. Harvard agrees with Marjorie's work. So, I mean, she reflects on sort of the emergence of cooperative ecosystems in places like Cleveland with the Evergreen Cooperative, or in Morganton, North Carolina, a textile manufacturing district where workers are coming together and looking at how do we create the conditions for good work, and how do we also meet the needs in our community, which might include childcare or affordable housing, and how do we do that in as deeply participative way as possible. Just a couple of other people who I think are really inspiring to follow right now. So one is Catherine Trebeck. She's based out of Scotland, one of the founders of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. But something she says that really strikes me is, you know, we never ask the economy to do the heavy lifting. We always let the economy make things very unequal, and then we try to fix the inequality after the fact. So we kind of patch, through processes of redistribution, we try to fix the deep wounds in our system. And we need to ask the economy to do more of the heavy lifting on the front end. And that, I think, involves some deep institutional redesign. Like, our institutions are not fit for purpose by and large. And so people like Kate Rayworth developed her donut economics kind of framework, and her colleagues are doing work to not just help policymakers, but also businesses become redistributive and regenerative by design. Could get more in nerd out on that. But the other person is Derek Hamilton at the New School, who's talking a lot right now about a human rights economy. So recognizing that, again, if we continue forward with a system of an economy that centers shareholder or wealth rights at the expense of the rights of people, communities, nature, et cetera, like, we are never going to get to a baseline kind of sense of stability and community and material flourishing that we need to reimagine this system and these structures. And so I think his invoking of the rights and responsibilities we have more broadly are also important in this reconceptualization.
Thank you both. Genovese has one of my favorite quotes ever, which is that it is the law of the moderator of the world, meaning God, that we be useful to one another. That keeps me going sometimes on a bad day. In the attempt to be useful to you all, I want to drop the conversation now a little bit into the practical realm. We've mentioned a whole bunch of negative consequences of the way we currently run our economy. Concentration of wealth and power, the commodification of things that should not and are not commodities. I mentioned globalization. You mentioned what we could call financialization, and the shift of the economy from making money by making things to making money by moving money around, and the aggregation of faceless ownership and what that means. There's a whole bunch we could talk about. So maybe before we open it up to a general Q&A, could you each just pick one? I know it'll be tough. Pick one of the economic pressures or economic conditions or trends that you are most concerned about, and then one of the policy prescriptions you're most excited about or inspired by the possibility of. Others, would maybe start with you.
So this is pretty meta, but I think it looms large for me. The continued emphasis on unfettered growth really troubles me. I've been talking with a lot of communities who are forming coalitions within Appalachia, Alaska, Hawaii, Richmond, Virginia. These are multi-stakeholder coalitions, usually involving local government alongside other civil society organizations, who are trying to form frameworks to guide local policy efforts that recognize that perhaps growth in and of itself doesn't need to be removed from the equation, but for whom and what needs to be brought into the equation. So this kind of blind pursuit of policies that support economic growth. And I think what we're seeing right now, this kind of emphasis in the US around kind of this emergence of the active nation state, interventionist state during the pandemic, and the kind of resurgence of industrial policy and this focus on reviving manufacturing jobs. I think there are ways, I think we have to be attentive to the ways that could end up kind of going back into trickle-down economics, that could end up privileging sort of larger, powerful firms or communities at the expense of some of this kind of more imaginative stuff happening on the ground in other communities around the country. So policy prescriptions that I find hope in. One specific example, in Hawaii, 14 indigenous leaders in Hawaii created something called Aina Aloha Economic Futures, which is a framework for how they are going to transition the state's economy to be less dependent on tourism and more centered on renewable sources of power and energy, centering in the indigenous values of Aina, of spirit, of earth. They're using principles of biomimicry, studying fish ponds and diverse, resilient ecosystems to guide those policy efforts. And I think that's just incredibly powerful and imaginative work. Now, that emerges within a very specific local context, right? And so I think the challenge for us in this country is how do you hold together generalizable principles with specific applications? And how do you let the community be the one to figure out where those two meet?
So I'm probably most troubled at this point by the combination of low wage exploitation on the one hand, and therefore high welfare dependency on the other hand. But because welfare isn't high, isn't generous in most instances, and often gets rationalized, i.e., is subject to the most savage cuts when there is any fiscal crisis, of course, that means people slide into precarity, poverty, and destitution. So we have a system where basically an honest job or a day's work doesn't pay enough. People cannot feed themselves and their families. They cannot raise kids. They cannot provide for their families and themselves properly. They don't have healthcare, and so much else besides, because wages aren't high enough. And yet profit margins aren't exactly very low. In a lot of sectors, not all, but in a lot of sectors, profit margins are high and rising. In fact, over the last 30 years, both in the US and almost to the same extent in the UK, you've had concentration of ownership across the board, right? And even if you go into your local supermarket and you see 30 different brands of breakfast cereals, it turns out that they're owned by 2 to 3 corporations. So there isn't even competition there. There's brand competition, but not genuine market competition that we could call, open and fair and actually in the interests of consumers and of the economy as a whole. But it's the wages that I'm most worried about. And I think we simply need higher wages. That doesn't mean that, profit margins can't also be, healthy, but I don't think the current system where basically we have an extraction of surplus value, and I'm sorry for sounding somewhat Marxian, if not downright Marxist, but I think we have that. We have a sort of a rentier economy where people who have assets are doing a lot better than those who only earn wages. So specifically, what can we do? We need higher minimum wages. We need to, in fact, move from the minimum wage to the living wage so that you can actually live off your wage. I would also go as far as saying we need a family wage so that people don't necessarily need a second job or 2 people working full-time and so on. There has to be a way in which families can live on a full-time job, and we don't have that at the moment. Of course, I would extend family wages to everyone who lives, in a relationship. This has nothing to do with one model of families, everything to do with households being able to survive and to thrive. I would therefore also have more collective bargaining so that people can actually get organized and do this, as workers. I would want to see union reform, of course, but I think unions have an important role to play in all this. I would have wage boards wherever possible, at whatever level, sectoral, regional, local, and I'd have worker co-determination. I'd have workers on company boards because I think that reduces the incidence of strikes. It makes it more cooperative. It helps wage growth, and it's better for the economy in the medium and long term. And honestly, who cares about next quarter's reports? It doesn't matter. We used to have an economy that was working quite well without quarterly reports because they're quite recent. Okay, the whole Milton Friedman mantra of short-term profit maximization is a recent invention, and it's just that. There is no economic law or any other law that tells you have to maximize profits in the short term. And in fact, what you see with that is higher volatility, a lot of disruption, and ultimately very few people are better off in an economy that's governed by short-term profit maximization. So let's have medium or longer-term profit optimization. That's a much better model where you reduce volatility and you try and do it in slightly more coordinated, cooperative ways. And if you think this sounds like communism, it doesn't. It's basically the West German economy after World War II. It's the Netherlands, it's Scandinavia, it's parts of France. This isn't anything like communism. This is everything to do with a social market economy that's properly embedded in social and civic ties.
Can I just mention, Chris,
course,
like I think this de-emphasizing short-term profit maximization in the US, there are some real legal and regulatory barriers that we need to dismantle and to do that, right? So the way we conceive of fiduciary responsibility, I mean, this whole industry built around maximizing shareholder wealth and interest. That's kind of what I was trying to get at earlier. So I think, and quite honestly, I think moves toward reimagining the corporation, the the B corporation movement, things like that, get us a little closer to thinking about, okay, we need other stakeholders to have a say in how corporations are run or how the economy is structured, but it's not going far enough. And so I think this is why you bringing in kind of co-determination, worker involvement, participation directly in the firms makes sense. I think it's going to start with smaller privately owned firms to start. Like it's hard to do that with, you know, the way kind of large corporations are currently structured, but it's starting to happen.
I am duty bound to very briefly shill for my own organization before I open up the floor. If you are interested in some thoroughly thoughtful policy proposals to increase worker voice and power in the workplace in a decidedly non-Marxist and in fact conservative fashion, please visit AmericanCompass.org.
Because we believe in competition, other websites are available, but it's a very good one.
And I think it is worth reflecting on how, in an important sense, how deeply conservative this conversation can be. It needed to be a strictly progressive conversation. I think that the flaw on the right for 40 years has been an obsession with this free market fundamentalism that we're talking about. The flaw on the left, in my opinion, has been an obsession with the kind of redistribution that you're talking about, which cannot fix a system that is fundamentally broken to begin with. And these common values of healthy families and thriving local communities and so on. We have a really encouraging foundation to find more common ground than one might think in addressing these questions. So with that having been said, let's open up the floor. Can I, Bren, ask for your help to use this mic, and then we'll share this one? EJ, let's go with EJ, and then we'll go to you next.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for the gift of your words. That was awesome. And I want to say that this conference has had many blessings for me. One was to meet the two of you guys, and the other was to meet Elizabeth, whom I've wanted to meet for a long time, and not just because she loves Catholic social thought and gave the best short description of subsidiarity I've heard in a long time. So thank you so much for that. That was a great introduction. I'd like to put three issues on the table, one of which Adrian touched upon already. I really like the fact that Pete's movie last night put a lot of stress on unions, and clearly the collapse of union density in our economy is a real loss in community and connection, let alone worker bargaining, but just in terms of community connection. Second point was something Pete Buttigieg talked about during his campaign, which is there was an expectation of something like lifelong work, and that people working together in the same place was a very powerful community builder and friendship builder. And the fact that there is no expectation of that anymore, I mean, and I'm not being nostalgic and saying, let's go all the way back to the way we were, but there is a real loss there. And I wonder if you could talk about that. And the last point is the gender division of labor that has been, I think, properly repealed, but our laws on family leave and all sorts of other practices and regulations around the workplace are completely out of touch, or largely out of touch, with the way work is done now. And I'd love for any of you to deal with any of those, but it's a real blessing to, if I may continue. So I'm moderating a panel on religion, so you'll have to forgive me. It's a real blessing to hear from all of you. Thank you.
Briefly, let's go.
Well, EJ, thank you so no mic. EJ, thank you so much. I mean, look, I you know, if my words were a gift, then you know, I can only thank you for receiving and returning them, because I think these are all fantastically important points. I think the collapse of union density is a hugely detrimental economic and social reality. This is first and foremost the principle of worker self-organization. So it's something that should appeal to both conservatives and progressives alike, albeit sometimes for different reasons, because it is about that. It's about people coming together around a shared purpose. So there's a teleology at work here, right? It is properly teleological. It's about you come together because you can't achieve it individually, and you wouldn't want it to be done to you by, say, the federal state, right? The federal government. So this is exactly what we want. It's a form of solidarity, subsidiarity, right? And it's very much in the spirit of association, right? That great principle of civic association that is so important to the American story. And it's the collapse of union densities, the way unions are run, because I do think there's a real internal problem in terms of the disconnect between union bosses and members, and that is true of all unions I can think of in the world. There are new examples of unions that are much more member-based, more participatory, and that's exactly what we need. But we're not going to get more unions that are more participatory unless we also create the conditions for that. You know, it's not something that will just emerge by itself. We have had a lot of anti-union legislation in the US and UK for a very long time, and I'm totally with Elizabeth. There are areas of our laws and regulations where we need to repeal. And where there is anti-union legislation, we need to look at it and probably repeal it, right? Because it's simply not serving the economy and workers very well at all. I agree about lifelong work. It's something which is incredibly valuable. It's not, again, possible to mandate it by law or by regulation, but we can change both the conditions and the context, but also incentivize it. So, for instance, people could be, rewarded over time, right, for a certain loyalty by their business or by public sector organizations. That could be even a form of co-ownership along cooperative models. So you could have both in the public and the private sector a greater emphasis on sharing in, if you like, in the equity of the organization that you're a part of. Right? And I think that should be part of remuneration, that you get a wage, but over time, you get a tiny, tiny share of the organization as well. Now, people say, oh, it's not practical because what happens when people move jobs? Well, there are ways of doing this, right? That happens in other cases, for instance, legal partnerships, right? People move on. It's possible we should have more of a cooperative element so that, longer term commitments and loyalty are rewarded both materially and otherwise. And on leave, yeah, look, for someone from outside the US, it is striking to hear, the discourse in political circles about family values, and then to kind of look and go, hang on a minute, where's your parental leave? I mean, it's just, it is shocking. I mean, I won't lie to you, it is shocking when, women give birth and 6 weeks later, often because of economic necessity, are compelled to be back at work. I mean, that is simply not a humane way of doing it at all. And it needs to be done completely along equal lines so that wherever possible, this can be shared between spouses. And there are lots of examples now in Europe where you have 1 year of leave. It's called parental leave for a reason, and it's shared by the two parents. Often, say if it is mother and father, the mother for the first 6 months for reasons to do, of course, with feeding the baby and so on. But then often the fathers pick up the second 6 months and do it increasingly gladly because they find it incredibly fulfilling, and they bond with their child far more than they otherwise would. I didn't with my first child because I was constantly commuting. I much regret it. I was lucky with the second because it was partly COVID, partly no longer commuting. But it's true. You only know when you miss it when it's already too late. So we must, in any way we can, incentivize, much more generous leave, and absolutely along equal lines so that it becomes a parental duty. And I think the word duty is also really important here. Fathers have a duty. Absent fathers, as we know, have been a huge problem in all sorts of communities. And I think we need to, make this both more equal, but also stress the importance that there are duties that come with certain things, not just rights. Rights are vitally important for human dignity, but it's the balance between rights and duties that I think we've also lost sight of. So I'd like us to talk about responsibilities and duties a bit more, and not as an imposition. Duties aren't impositions. My duty to my family or to my friends or my colleagues is not just an imposition. It's actually something, again, that's part of my flourishing. Yeah. If I didn't have duties, I couldn't flourish as a human being. Mm-hmm. So let's not pretend that duties are just an infringement on our liberty. That's the wrong conception of liberty. Liberty is not freedom from, it's freedom to. It's to act individually as well as together for a purpose. So when we have teleology, duties actually become something liberating. So the paradox is when you have duties, you are free as a human being than if you don't.
Is there anything you would like to add to that?
This question of care has very much been on my mind. I had a child 2 years ago as the Build Back Better legislation was coming together on Capitol Hill. And I remember feeling like the language was really disturbing to me, like how investing in care would be good for the economy. And I thought, well, how about investing in care being good for our human flourishing, for our communities, for becoming who we're meant to become? Because becoming a parent has been, it's been a spiritual path and journey for me. It's been essential to becoming who I will become and am becoming. And I think what you brought up earlier about things like family wages, there is a kind of imagination and a creativity we have not even scratched the surface of when it comes to not just that initial parental leave, but forms of, you know, paying for childcare and elderly care and neighbor care and things, you know, it could be, and I think this is where there's a lot to do across the political aisle. Like, it could be that there's a combination of daycare centers and a family member, you know, who's receiving a subsidy to take care of your child. Or so I think there's just a lot of work yet to be done to create the policy structures that will enable us to care in ways that are so core to who we are as humans.
Chris, I'm informed that the microphones in the ceiling are picking up all of our voices, and that's not at all creepy. So we don't need to use the.
You do need to use.
Oh, they use it.
All right.
Across Q&A, we're good.
For thoughtful proposals on supporting working families, AmericanComps.org. I promise to go to you. Did you still have a question? And then I think in the interest of time, let's make that the last group question, and then we'll split up and talk in smaller groups. But go ahead, sir.
Thank you all three of you for the presentation. I have all agreement, and my neighbors in Indianapolis would probably agree with this. Except the idea when we're talking a lot about capital and stuff, currency and social currency. This idea that there's been a lot of focus on the physical currency of money. You got trust, you got imagination, social capital, those type of relational currencies. What is it? How does an institution inject that type of currency into its fabric? Not its structure, but its social fabric.
It's your institution redesign. You want to start?
That's a really, really tough one. And, you know, I can only think of a few examples. I mean, one I think is co-determination, because what it means is that you're basically valuing workers, not just as people who, you know, doing a job for you and getting paid, but as a, you know, co-creator of that organizational culture that they're all a part of. So I think it is empowering people. I think that's one way, is by giving them both the recognition that they are, you know, important stakeholders, to use that language, but that they are, you know, an integral part. And I think we can extend that to other forms of corporate governance reforms. Because something
Sorry,
that
can you just define co-determination?
Yeah, so it's basically worker representation on company boards, okay? So it's to say the company is no longer just run by the chief executive and a board of managers, but there's now worker representation on that board. And of course, if you have a company structure where you also have some form of supervisory board, then workers will be on both boards, right? So whether it's single board or dual board structures, you'd have worker representation of them all. That's more than just worker on remuneration committees, though that is, of course, a first step. But I think it's really to say in the running of the business, however large or small, there should be the voice of workers represented, okay? And whether that is done purely at the business level, where the workers elect someone, or whether it's done through a union, I mean, they're different models, but I think that is absolutely vital. I think corporate governance reform could and should go further. And I think it would do partly what you say, you know, the injection of this different kind of currency into the organization culture. So for example, with hospitals, schools, the railways, water boards, or whatever it is, you could think of a tripartite arrangement whereby you always have the managers and or funders, depending on what it is, right? And that could sometimes be the state, that could sometimes be a private business. You would have the workers and you would have the people who are essentially the consumers of whatever it is that you're talking about. So for instance, for hospitals, you would have the funders, you would have the workers, so doctors, nurses, and so on, but you'd also have the patients who are represented in some shape or form, okay? For railways, you would have the funders, the workers, and the passengers, and so on and so forth. For schools, it would be, you'd have whoever funds the school, the teachers, and parents and pupils, okay? So there's all sorts of ways. Why tripartite? Because it means that no one
part of it is hegemonic and can just dictate the rest. There would have to be negotiation and there would have to be compromise, at least amongst two of the three groups, okay? That would make it more relational, more cooperative. So I think we need to just pluralize our corporate governance arrangement so it's not hijacked or dominated by a single interest, because that's what we've had for far too long, the kind of shareholder model that you talked about.
Diaman, I think this question is making me reflect on the culture shifts we need to have the capacity to think differently about the economy and about money, which I think comes often from experiences of our own personal transformation, often born of suffering, or a longing for something different or a longing for something meaningful. So for example, I've been a part of 2 little experiments in childcare that uses time banking. So I'm not paying you to watch my kid from 3 to 5, but you're going to watch my kid from 3 to 5 and you get 2 points. And then you trade those 2 points in for me to watch your kid from 8 to 10 the next week, right? So it's actually thinking about non-monetary forms of exchange. There's some, I think thinking that comes like that when that's born of neighborhood relationships, right? It's knowing it's breaking bread with your neighbors, understanding, well, what are your needs? What are my needs? How do we show up in support of each other's needs? And I think that kind of thinking that money isn't the most important thing comes when we sit with each other's stories and we build real, authentic relationships with each other. Otherwise, the mythology that the good life is about getting as much money and stuff as you can is in your face all the time. So to deconstruct that, I think, is a cultural shift that feels like it comes from just being present to the idea of gifts. I have gifts to offer, you have gifts to offer. Can we be in relationships such that we're exchanging gifts with each other?
If I could just add very briefly on this question of the relationship between an institution's structure and its internal social fabric. Adrian was talking about co-determination and worker representation on corporate boards. They did a study in Scandinavia where about half of the companies in the study group had that kind of worker board representation, the other half did not, and then watched what they did during the financial crisis in 2008. And those companies that had a facility, a mechanism for that trusted exchange of information between management and workers, were a lot more likely, for example, to not use mass layoffs to handle the budget cuts they needed to do, and a lot more likely for everyone to agree to take a pay cut temporarily so that everyone could stay employed and then bounce back. Both groups of companies had to cut the same amount to stay alive. They did it in very different ways because of that, the presence or absence of that structural mechanism of trusted communication. All right, we have a little less than 20 minutes. I would love that for us to break into smaller groups for about 10 minutes. And I'll ask you all to discuss a version of the same question that I asked the 2 of our panelists. The first is, what brought you to this session? You are at the very least interested, probably more than interested and concerned about the relationship of economics and social characters and human thriving. Why? I want you to share that with one another. What brought you into this conversation? Or what do you think would bring the people in your life into this conversation? What are you concerned about? What's your entry point? And then relatedly, what is the potential way out that most inspires you? What's your biggest hope or preferred policy mechanism, or at least question that you would like to see answered? And especially if it's something that hasn't already been mentioned, and share that with one another. And then we'll spend the last 5 minutes. I'll call us all back and we can share briefly with one another before we break.
Just share the highlights of what you talked about. Why don't we start with this corner and then we'll just go clockwise around the room.
Namely, this is a takeaway from the conference in general. This seems to be a unique conference in that everyone comes from very different professional backgrounds and is coming together under this very broad umbrella of social connection. So it's interesting to see how everyone makes that entry point with your
Well, I brought up the concern for true conservatism, which is maintaining the culture into the future. The bio community, the plants, animals, trees, waterways, mountains should be included in our concern for economics. This is our home, right? And why aren't we being responsible members of the Earth community, partners, not dominators? And I think economics has to bring itself around back to our sustainable societies who've been doing that for tens of thousands of years. Thank you.
All right, back corner.
I enjoyed the discussion around impacts of geo relocation and how communities are shifting and whether where communities previously had created commonality and shared bonds and supporting one another, when they get dispersed, they might lose a lot of that support network.
One thing, we talked about people, when they come to work, it's not just the work they do. They also come as whole people. And that is also something that should be valued at the workplace.
All right, last group, take us home.
Well, we went a lot of different places. So I'll just say, I think there was a little bit of conversation about culture and how that needs to be in the boardroom, similar to what you guys were talking about, and how do we help people flourish also in companies in terms of culture and what a difference that can make. So I'm sorry to the policy guys. I didn't represent your points of view quite as well.
Well, thank you so much. I've enjoyed this conversation. I hope you have. Thank you both for sharing your thoughts.